currently living through some of the darkest time of Armenian history. For the last 2 months, our lives in Artsakh, Armenia, and diaspora have been taken over by this nightmarish reality of war, ethnic cleansing, loss of life, loss of land, internal unrest in Armenia, and most horrific war crimes. At the Armenian Institute, we've been trying to support people affected by the war in many different ways. Since September 27th, we've been writing open letters, emails, we've been tweeting, a lot of it falling to deaf ears. We've been trying to raise awareness via our events, blog posts, articles, and we've been also trying to provide practical support. Last week, we held a major fundraising event, Arts for Artsakh, to raise funds for All Armenian Funds Himnadram. It brought together many talented musicians, performers, poets, and artists to raise money and also distract us and soothe us a bit with art. I'm very proud to say today, which is the last day of the fundraiser actually, we raised some £17,000. I will share the links to the fundraiser in the chat line, so please go and support and also watch our beautiful video if you'd like. War and ethnic cleansing are accompanied by loss of culture, art traditions, architecture, language, and dialects as well. And today, at our event at the Armenian Institute, we'd like to talk about cultural cleansing with our two guests. Over this last several weeks, I'm sure everyone has seen heartbreaking images of people visiting Dadivang for last time, lighting candles. And it's very important to understand how we can deal with loss of culture, what are the next steps, and what we can learn from other similar situations from other cultures. Before we start, just a few quick housekeeping points. As you realized, everyone is on mute, and after our guest presentations, you will have a chance to ask questions. You can put your questions in the chat line at the bottom of the screen. We'll be moderating them and try to answer as many as we can. The event will be recorded, so please turn your videos off if you don't want to be recorded. And I will share several links in the chat line to our website, to our fundraiser, and the feedback form. We'll be grateful if you can fill it in. Now it's my great pleasure to invite my colleague, Dr. Susan Pattie, the founding director of the Armenian Institute and our current program manager, to tell us more about the event.
Thank you, Dr. Vig. I'm going to be introducing them one by one, as Christina will speak first, and then Heghnar. But I just wanted to, Dr. Vig has already actually said much of what I was going to say, so that works out well. It is an evening to think about the ways in which both the tangible and intangible aspects of culture are wiped out along with the wars all over the world. And we can think of a lot of other examples. And most of us have grown up in countries where this has happened at different times in our history. I think of the United States and the Native Americans. That doesn't make it any better. It's not like saying that therefore it's just normal. It's not normal. We wish it wasn't still happening, and it's to have it happening before our very eyes is very hard to bear. Christina and Heghnar, both art historians, will be taking different aspects of these questions tonight, and then we'll have a chance afterwards to ask them questions, to ask them both questions, to ask them singly. I'd like to first introduce Christina, who is the here we go, Arthur Dadyanen Ara Ostemel, I don't want to get that wrong, professor of Armenian Art and Architecture at Tufts University near Boston. She's also the chair of the Department of Art and Art History. These days, that must be quite a torturous job with Zoom and everything else. Don't envy that. She's also the author of numerous books and articles. Most recently, The Art of Armenia, an Introduction, which we now have in our library. And also Vigilant Powers, 3 Churches of Early Medieval Armenia. Christina is going to give us a big picture today, starting out that way. We had talked about, I know it promises you that she's going to talk about Ani, but we'll perhaps do that in the question and answer period. She's going to spend more time on Artsakh, which is on everybody's mind right now. So Christina, over to you. Thank you very, very much for coming tonight. As I said to both of them, I know they're both in big demand these days, so we're very lucky to have them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to the Armenian Institute for having me speak. Susan had asked me to speak about the big picture and maybe also about Ani. I want to focus first on the big picture and what the basic situation is, and then I want to move into talking about some specific monuments in Artsakh that form part of the districts or are situated in the districts that will be handed over. So as you maybe all know, on November 9th, there was an agreement between Armenia, among Armenia, Azerbaijan, and organized by Russia that meant handing over several districts of Artsakh to Azerbaijan. As you probably know, Artsakh is home to a rich and diverse monumental heritage, including all kinds of monuments, ancient to modern, Christian and Islamic, religious and civic, and I'm just showing you some examples of those here, including one of the Melik palaces, a medieval bridge, a fortress at Handapert, and a mosque. But the largest corpus of monuments by far are the Armenian churches and monasteries of Artsakh, and these are now at risk. As you know, Azerbaijan has an appalling record of deliberate cultural erasure. And just recently, I learned of new destruction at Ganach Jam, Church of the Baptist, John the Baptist in Shushi, which you can see on the before and after, left and right, with the destruction of its tower-like domes. In addition to that, and for maybe of great pertinence to today's event is the campaign of art washing that has been undertaken by Azerbaijan, in which there are deliberately disseminated falsehoods about the Armenian churches being really Albanian. And I'm showing you here a tweet from somebody from the Ministry of Culture in Azerbaijan about Dadivank and calling it Albanian. And this is being done, of course, to deny the historical presence of Armenians in the region. Now, among the monuments that have been discussed in the context of recent news of cultural destruction by Azerbaijan, the most often cited monuments and sites are Dadivank, Kazanchetsot's Cathedral, which was twice bombed and now, as you can see on the right, graffitied, and also the archaeological site of Tikranagert. So those are some of the most common sites that are mentioned, but there are many more in Artsakh that are part of the areas that are going to be handed over. And just I've listed several more here: Tsitsianavank, Amaras, Katichevank, Vankasar, Varasgom, and Yaritsmankans. But there are, in fact, many, many, many more than that that are going to be turned over. And here I've just outlined in red the area of Kashatagh, or Berdzor, or Lachin, sometimes called district. And you can see that if we look at that area outlined in red, we have in this area alone many, many monuments. And if we were even to expand further, we could come up with even that many monuments and sites. And this is just, again, from Kashatagh district. So we're talking about a massive number of sites that are at risk. And the question I think that all of us are wondering about and thinking about and worrying about is what to do about this. What I want to do in the rest of this presentation is just do what I do, which is art history, and talk a little bit about a series of monuments that are going to be turned over, and ask some questions about them, and maybe have us think about how the history of art and architecture can serve in this moment to inform the public, inform the media, inform policymakers so that they can make good decisions, and also at the same time challenge this practice of art washing that is now happening on the web, particularly on social media. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, this is a time, as Tadevik said, of tremendous pain and anxiety. And I want to, in this moment, to also remind us that these monuments have the potential to give, even from a distance, great happiness. And studying them is important not only because it can correct the kind of misinformation that's out there, but it also can give a tremendous amount of solace. So with that, I want to take us to Tsitsernavank in the Kashatak region and look a little bit at this basilica, this Christian basilica dating from the 5th to 6th centuries. And I show you here a view of it as well as a plan on the right. And I should say, full disclosure, I am not a specialist on Artsakh. I wish I were, but I am an expert more generally on Armenian architecture. But for me, therefore, this region and the monuments in it are very interesting because of the ways in which they connect very clearly with architectural traditions from farther north. And here I'm making a comparison between Tsitsernavank and Ashtarak, Tsiranavor, a basilica located in what is now the Republic of Armenia. And I want you to notice that both in the plans and in elevations, these bear striking similarities. Both of them longitudinal basilicas with apses and side aisles, both of them with these T-shaped piers, at least in this case on the northern side, and both very similar in elevation, even down to the paired windows, arched windows that you see high up on the elevation of both. So what we're talking about is very much a tradition in Artsakh, even from the 5th and 6th centuries, that's connected to what is happening farther north. Now, I want to move to images of the interior and drawings of the interior to show you, though, something very interesting about the basilica, which has been pointed out, and there's a quote here from Thierry and Donabedyan's book on Armenian art, in which they notice that there's an exceptional aspect to this basilica. It is a gallery level right above the apse, and you see it here, of three arcades. Now, this is striking, rightly noted by Thierry and Donabedyan as exceptional, and it is something for which I do not have any comparative evidence. And it's very strange from a liturgical point of view to put a gallery directly above the apse. Why? Why do this? I'm asking this in part rhetorically, in part not. I'm really curious. Why was it done? Was it done to provide some elite person with this privileged position above the apse? That would be extremely, I think, arrogant if that were the case. Was it done for a choir to sing? We don't know. Those are questions that need to be asked and need to be explored, and one hopes that they will be, because it's not enough to do archaeological work and describe this monument. We have to ask questions about its context, about its liturgical function, and basically how it worked as a monument. So I'm raising that simply as a question, something to ponder over. Moving north into Carvajar District, again, this area outlined in red. Within it are at least this many monuments. And among them, of course, is Dadivank, which you see here in plan and view. And again, this has been much discussed, much covered in the media. A reminder that Dadivank is covered in Armenian inscriptions, presenting, I think, for anybody who wished to erase them, to call this an Albanian monument, a formidable task. But this is obviously very, very worrying for those of us who value this monument, not just as an aesthetic work, but as essentially a history book in stone. We are lucky that the inscriptions are transcribed, but of course, should anything happen to them, it would severely limit our ability to understand this monument as a whole, how it was meant to be understood. And I mean to say here that inscriptions aren't just texts. Inscriptions are essentially part of a building. They become part of the building. They're really, in a sense, the way the building speaks to us. And more people who study inscriptions understand that what's important about them is not just the words, but the materials, their placement in the building, below a window, next to a door, next to sculpture, so that the whole context of an inscription has to be understood. And that's another reason why this building needs to be recorded. Dadivank is fascinating also for its sculpture, and I just wanted to show you here some of it. One of my favorite passages of sculpture here is on the portal, on the facade, which you see here on the western facade. And there are these very interesting examples of pipe molding, as it's called, this kind of tubular molding, in this case forming alternating triangle-like forms. Here again, we might look to regions farther north, to monasteries of Goshavank and Makaravank, to think about how here the stones of the portals, the voussoirs, we can call them, I guess, form alternating trapezoidal forms, not unlike what we see at Dadivank. So here again, we can think in terms of a connected tradition, a tradition that is encompassing not just Artsakh, but regions to the north in the 13th centuries. And along those lines, I want to remind everybody of the beautiful frescoes recently restored inside Dadivank. In this case, on the right, showing the Virgin and St. Nicholas. Again, with this, we can think about connections. We can think about connections to Byzantine art. And I'm just showing you the version of Vladimir, a famous example of Byzantine icon painting from the 12th century. An art historian wouldn't feel like it was enough simply to say this looks Byzantine, but would want to ask, what were the sources of this Byzantine art? Were they icons, manuscripts, or frescoes? How did the painter of Dadivank know Byzantine traditions? And why was this Byzantine mode of painting selected? Obviously, it wasn't pressed on the painter. It was chosen for a reason. So again, these are questions like with Cicernavank that we want to think about, open questions, questions that need to be thought about and asked. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit further. We're going to talk about what is my favorite element of artistic element, let's say, in Artsakh, and that takes us from Dadivank to Handaberd. I'm showing you here a page from the Researches on Armenian Architecture, a volume dedicated to the Armenian cultural monuments in Karabakh, and it shows you a khachkar in Handaberd that is attached to the north wall of the chapel in Handaberd. And the khachkar is generally dated to the 12th to 13th centuries. And this passage of sculpture shows us a khachkar, and below, in a little arch, a little sheltering arch, a image that is probably the Virgin and Child, and it shows the Virgin and Child breastfeeding. In the volume I just showed you, there was no comment on this fact. the unusual quality of this image. But in fact, it is a very unusual image to see and deserves our attention. It is known in Latin as the Virgo lactans, in Greek as the Galactotrophusa, and it's a rare image known from first from Egypt and also from Byzantium and Europe, but not by very many examples. And this is the same as in Armenia, where there are very few examples of this scene. And I'll just show you one of the most famous ones, and that is of Toros Taronetsi. And this is from the 14th century. So already you can see this, that the material from Artsakh is raising real questions about relations with other cultures. The fact that this detail, that this image could be even earlier than Toros Taronetsi, raises questions about Artsakh as a kind of place, a cradle for inventive forms and new image types. There are also questions about theology that this raises. Why the Virgin and Child shown breastfeeding here at this moment in this church? There are social questions. Perhaps did this have to do with the patron? What can we say about the other khachkars that are inscribed, that are around this one? So lots of questions to ask. And I'm going to now move. I hope I'm still within the time. I assume, Susan, that you'll interrupt me if I go over, but I'm just going to keep going for now. I want to turn now to look finally at the region of Akhdam, where we have yet more monuments. The most famous among them, of course, Tigrana-Kert, the archaeological site, is very famous, but also Amaras, the site of the burial of the grandson of Gregory the Illuminator in the 5th century. And Hamlet Petrosyan has done wonderful archaeological work demonstrating that the tomb, which lies right beneath the apse of the basilica, was actually open to the east. And I won't get into too much of the details here. He has published this material, but it would have been accessible by the east. And this is a kind of radical revision of what we thought previously, according to Murad Hazratian. So really interesting. Hamlet argues that this is connected to the eastern opening, or the eastern portal at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is fascinating and suggests a particular relationship with Jerusalem and with Hagiopolite meanings in Amaras. So, but the question then would be, why and how was this choice made? So if we're talking, for example, of a Constantinian or post-Constantinian revival at Amaras, why did it happen? What was the context for that? Okay, so I'm going to end with one last monument, and that is Zavardnos. Well, look at that. So here we have Zavardnos, which last time I checked was in the Republic of Armenia. Now, Zavardnos, as you know, is a very famous monument, and it is a type that was copied at Ani, at the Church of Gagkashen, and had a probably 7th century life that was then built over in Taik, Tau, and this is the Church of Bana. But while most people know that, maybe fewer people know that there is an aisled tetraconch of the Zavardnos type also in present-day northwest Azerbaijan, and this is the Church of Lekit. Not much is known about this church, but I think you can see immediately that it belongs to this family of churches that we know from Armenia. So what I've just been talking about is a tradition or series of traditions at Artsakh that are connected in important ways to the regions farther to the north and to the west, as well as to the Byzantine world. And but at the same time, it's a tradition that is distinctive and that is urgently in need of art historical exploration. So just to conclude, the Armenian churches, monasteries, cemeteries, khachkars in Artsakh are very important because they are material testimony to long-time Armenian presence in the region. They form sacred centers. They show the connectedness of the region to surrounding areas and cultures throughout history. And then the question becomes, all that is well and good, and we can talk about it amongst ourselves, but how do we demonstrate this, the value of this material to those who have a voice? And I would just end by saying, if there were ever a time for emergency art history, this is the time. And I will stop with that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Christina. And what we need in this emergency moment is great leaders like you and Heghnar and others who can lead the forces of art historians and like archaeologists take their people and teach them how to do it. This is what has to be done. Thank you so much. And it's great to have you go over the connections both within the Armenian world, but also with the Byzantine world, and to show how the cross-cultural borrowings take place and what that teaches us about our history and other people's history. We'll go on to Heghnar now and come back to you, Christina, afterwards. Thank you so much. Heghnar Watenpaugh is wrong piece of paper, is the professor of art history at University of California at Davis. And she was the winner of the 2019 Der Mukherjee Armenian Studies Book Award, sponsored by the Society for Armenian Studies, the SAS, for Missing Pages. And this sounds like I haven't read this book yet. It sounds really fascinating, and it adds to this business of our art historians being like detectives, doing all this amazing detective work that's so necessary. It takes a certain kind of brain to be able to hold all those pieces there. So the short story of the Missing Pages is that the Armenian Church has sued the J. Paul Getty Museum for 8 pages of the Zaytun Gospels, which got separated evidently during the genocide. And the Armenians, I think quite rightly, wanted to put them back together again. So you need to buy the book to find out exactly how this happened. But one of the things I liked very much about the write-up that I saw about it was it reminded me of our treasured objects, where the object has a story to tell. It has a very long story to tell in this case, and you can learn so much about Armenian history, about social and as Christina was just saying. Now there's so much to learn from these objects about our social life, theology, how it changes through the objects, through their life. She had written an earlier, both of these women have written lots of things, but I'll just briefly say that her first book also won an award, and that was the Spiro Kostov Book Award for the image of an Ottoman city architecture in Aleppo. And Heghnar is going to speak to us today, first of all, about Aleppo and Syria, her work there. I had asked her to help us to think about the ways in which monuments are erased in other places as well, and what do people do about it? What are the ways in which people can react in positive way, or not positive ways to this, but what can we do about it, basically? She's going to be talking to us about that, and we'll just see where that takes us. So Heghnar, thank you very much for coming, and we'll turn over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan, for having me. Thank you, Armenian Institute, for organizing this. And I'm so glad to see so many people here. Let me get my slide in order. So as I'm going to skip ahead to the part of the presentation that Susan had asked me to discuss, which was perspectives from other places. So this was me as a PhD student a few years ago when I was doing field work in Syria in what now feels like the good old days, but in fact at the time it was not that great because of course the Syrian regime was there, and the groundwork for so much injustice was established at the time. So I'm going to talk about the Syrian civil war and maybe the Arab Spring in general, and and what we have learned from the maybe some limited successes, but mostly from the failures of trying to save the cultural heritage of Arab countries, and especially Syria, during the very difficult years that followed the initial hopes of the Arab Spring in 2011. And what I'm showing you on the screen now is a graffiti that appeared on the walls of Cairo around 2011, at the first moment of hope and possibility. And this was done by graffiti artists known as Ganzir and others known as Tank versus Bicycle. The graffiti is no longer extant, and Ganzir, the artist, now lives elsewhere. So this was the Great Mosque of Aleppo, a venerable medieval building that is one of the oldest Islamic buildings in Aleppo, and is established on the site of a previous Byzantine cathedral. And it has, as you see here, this beautiful 10th century minaret. And on April 23rd, 2013, that minaret was destroyed, and you're seeing a news photograph from that. And this is another view of Aleppo after the shelling that compromised the structure of the minaret. And right around those days, I was in a meeting with some architectural historians, and one of my colleagues, who is a specialist of European architecture and happens to be British. I don't know if that explains anything, but he was talking about the destruction of the Mosque of Aleppo, and he said, wow, that really affected me. I had read about the many people, by then I think almost 100,000 Syrians who had been killed, but the destruction of the minaret really hit me in the gut. And I'm sure this is a sentiment that was shared by many, not just him. And at the time, I did not think very well of him for being so callous about the loss of life and so sensitive to the loss of architecture. But upon reflection, it taught me something very important, which is for the broader public, not Syrians necessarily, but for the international community, the destruction of culture and cultural heritage in general can stand as a very powerful symbol that can become a rallying point for them to want to take positive action. Whereas the large numbers of victims, it's difficult to understand or to comprehend, and let's face it, in some cases, to feel sympathy. But when it comes to cultural heritage, the international community is galvanized. And this is extremely problematic, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I want to build on that insight now. In Aleppo as well, there were a large number of destroyed structures. The Armenian Church of the 40 Martyrs suffered some damage, though it is not as badly damaged as initially thought. Here is a more detailed a series of photographs consisting both of photographs taken on the ground and photographs taken from aerial views and satellite views. I'm going to talk briefly about the Citadel of Aleppo, the symbol of the city, and the structures in front of its monumental gate, the area around here. So this is the monumental gate of the Citadel. A view facing it, it's composed of many layers, but the layers you're seeing now was built by a son of Saladin, Al-Zahir Ghazi, in the 13th century. And during the war, the Citadel it reclaimed its military function. And so it became used in various military activities and suffered damage. Across from the gate of the Citadel is this Ottoman structure, the Khosrofieh Mosque and complex, which plays a very important role in my first book, because my first book was about the Ottoman reinvention, revisualization, reformulation of Aleppo. And this mosque was completed in the middle of the 16th century and is one of the early works credited to the architect Sinan, the great imperial Ottoman architect. So this remarkable structure, this is how it appeared up until 2014, and the entire area had been recently the subject of a major rehabilitation, in part through the support of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And in 2014, these are again before and after images where, so again, this is an archival photograph from the Library of Congress showing the Citadel, its main gate, and the Khosrofieh Mosque across from it. And here again, aerial views taken from 2011, the mosque and its area is intact. And then by July 2014, aerial views show already that the mosque is now completely destroyed. And there are, I'm sorry, the yellow arrows are an area next to the mosque. The mosque is here, so July 2014, the mosque still stands, but by August 10, 2014, aerial views show that the mosque too has been destroyed. And this is a crater, a photograph of a crater, which is what the Khosrofieh Mosque is reduced to today. So here I want to talk, to say a few things about documentation, and to borrow a term from our sociologist friends, data asymmetry. And here to talk about this method, I'll take as a model the organization called Physicians for Human Rights. Maybe some of you are familiar with them. They are a very important organization who specialize in advocating for the welfare of physicians and medical professionals and medical infrastructure worldwide. And they also advocate for medical professionals from a human rights perspective. They took on the task of documenting challenges and assaults on medical infrastructure in Syria since 2011, because in part a feature of the Syrian conflict was the deliberate targeting of medical infrastructure. Why? Because if you destroy medical infrastructure and you assassinate doctors, that means that you have not only harmed the doctors, but you have also caused further harm to those individuals that the doctor could have helped. So you can see how this is a particular kind of cruelty. It is against all kinds of agreements and covenants and, of course, basic decency. But it was a hallmark of the Syrian conflict. It still is. And we also saw this in Artsakh when the maternity hospital in Stepanakert was shelled, I believe in October. So why am I showing you this? One of the ways in which Physicians for Human Rights was documenting the attacks on medical infrastructure, this showed very much the challenges of gathering evidence during wartime and during lulls in fighting for the destruction of infrastructure. Physicians for Human Rights is the organization of the many organizations that were interested in documenting destruction in Syria. It is the one that, in my view, elaborated the most comprehensive methodology, which is detailed on their site. Their goal was to document attacks on medical infrastructure at a very high level of of proof in order to gather evidence for possible future processings. So those were the standards that they were following. And this is where the idea of data asymmetry comes from. In wartime, how are we able to document what is happening on the ground? One of the tools that one disposes of is aerial photography, satellite imagery, remote sensing, etc. Very sophisticated tools that can be deployed to gather certain kinds of evidence. We're seeing that used here. But what is also needed is a sort of ground truthing of these activities. How are these changes that one sees from the air documented on the ground? So an image like this shows you that. And in a situation in the Syrian civil war, as is the case in other conflicts, including Karabakh, because you have very strong propaganda machinery, certainly on the Syrian regime side and also by several of the opposing groups and certainly ISIS, is very difficult to gather reliable information or to gather information, especially images that have not been heavily manipulated and distorted. So one of the tasks that international organizations spent a lot of time on in Syria that I think was a limited success was to train local activists to gather evidence. Even if you dispose of nothing other than your phone, a small camera, you can still do the kinds of human rights information gathering that can be crucial for later. In a type of conflict situation like the Syrian civil war and also Karabakh, in the age of social media and videos that can be uploaded almost instantly, one has the sense that one is almost there at the front lines, or with individuals committing human rights violations. One is present, one is seeing there. But it's important to realize that we don't see everything. We only see what we are given to see. And at every stage of the process, who is recording information, who speaks, who presents the information, how is the information presented, how is the information disseminated, and how we receive that information as the international public, and how we understand it. At every stage of this process, nothing is neutral, everything is complex, and there are different pressures at every point. And in all of this, of course, ever present is the issue of power asymmetry and struggles of power. Who has the power to disseminate images more than others? Who has the power to speak? Who has the power to influence? These were some of the issues that were very clear during the Syrian civil war, and we continue to see them in other conflicts. So I will now speak very briefly about Palmyra. Of course, Palmyra is in the middle of the Syrian desert. It's an oasis, and it was in antiquity, as it continues to be today, a nexus of the various trade routes that crisscross the desert. It is a stunning site. Maybe some of you have had the good luck to visit it. And during the murderous summer of 2015, where ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, gained a great deal of territory and took over Palmyra, of course, the ruins are right next to the contemporary city of Tadmor, which is strategically important because it is the key to the desert. When ISIS were in Palmyra, they proceeded to first looting the archaeological site of Palmyra and then destroying aspects of it, including the Temple of Bel. An incredibly beautiful structure, which was destroyed during the summer of 2015. So I'm going to show you a couple of images produced by Syrians in reaction to the destruction in Palmyra. Here we see a composite of various sites in Palmyra. The statue of a woman is based on one of those very unique antique funerary statues for which Palmyra is known, and the statue is weeping tears. And a representative of Isis is about to behead this individual, and we also see migrants moving away. So I'm showing you this to give you a sense of the kind of pain and suffering that Syrians experienced as a result of the destructions in Palmyra. This is, and I'm sorry if this is distressing, but this was a drawing published by Jihad Avartani, where the artist equates the destruction of the cultural heritage, and here we have a reference to Mosul and the Mosul Museum, which was also destroyed and looted by ISIS, and the destruction of humanity. This man is wearing an orange shirt on which the writing says humanity. On this shirt, the statue is wearing an orange outfit that says the heritage of the cultural heritage of the world, the cultural heritage of humans. So here the artist makes a very clear parallel between the destruction of cultural heritage and the destruction of humanity. And so I want to talk about this question for a moment, but I will take this image off of the screen, and so maybe we can look at something more beautiful. Here I want to say a few words about the concept of world heritage, which is a way of thinking about cultural heritage that evolved in particular in the wake of the Second World War. Around the time when the United Nations was created, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so the post-war movement of pushing for human rights and the post-war desire to create a world where the horrors seen in the Second World War would not happen again. And part of that sort of impetus or momentum was the idea of world heritage, which holds that any great work of art created by any human anywhere is not only the heritage of that the creator's culture or state or nation or tribe, etc. Of course, it belongs to that culture, but the great works of art belong to all of humanity. And a corollary of that is if a work of art somewhere is intentionally destroyed or desecrated, all of us as the human family have lost something. It is not only Syria that has lost its monument, but all of us. It is not only Afghanistan that suffers when the Buddhas of Bamiyan are blown up, but all of us. So it's this sense of global human solidarity, global celebration of the best creations of the human family. That's, in short, is the idea of world heritage, and it's a great idea. No one could be against it. But it has, and it's a UNESCO as an organization is in part founded on that idea, and the World Heritage List aims to compile the great achievements of all of humanity. So here, ignore the writing here. I just want to show you what happens when something is destroyed. It is irreplaceable. So here we're seeing the famous Arch of Palmyra, which was, of course, destroyed by ISIS. And here is one of the many artistic projects that was made internationally in response to the destruction of Palmyra, and the recreations of the arch in various places. Here we see the recreation in New York in 2016. The recreated arch was in other places as well. And in part, these recreations are possible thanks to 3D imaging and laser photography and other high-tech methods of photographing objects in order to recreate them. And there are many merits to this incredible ability to capture these ancient sculptures. But of course, the fact remains that the original has been destroyed. It was destroyed at a specific time, a specific place, by a specific group of people. I don't know how much time I have, but I want to make a very quick point about so far I talked about the destruction of heritage and the failures of preventing the destruction of heritage in Syria. I want to make a point about another way of thinking about heritage that has emerged, especially in the last 20 years, which is to think of heritage as a medium for thinking about difficult pasts, for restoring dignity to groups that have been wronged or persecuted or have suffered natural disasters in the past, and even cultural heritage as a medium for reconciliation. And this way of thinking was very prominent, especially in Unesco, and I'm happy to recommend some readings on that if people are interested. And Ani, we mentioned Ani previously. As some of you may recall, Ani, which is of course located in Turkey, was nominated to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2016. This is a photograph from the meeting of the Committee for a Global Patrimony in July 2016 in Istanbul, the same time when at the session where Ani was declared, was placed on the World Heritage List. And of course, here is a photograph of Ani as well. So the monuments are nominated on the World Heritage List by the states in which they are located. It's one of the properties, one of the characteristics of the World Heritage List, and one of its shortcomings as well is that everything is done through the states that are members of UNESCO. So if you have a group that is not part of the state, a group that is being persecuted by the state, that voice, it is very difficult for UNESCO to make room for that voice. So here's the ambassador and his team from Turkey during the same session. And here is Vahram Kajoyan, the Armenian ambassador to UNESCO at the time. He is now the Armenian ambassador to Vietnam. And he is a great diplomat. And at the time, he spoke in favor of Ani being placed on the World Heritage List. And this had been part of a very long period of connections between the Armenian Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Turkey, and between various cultural heritage activists and art historians in Turkey and in Armenia and the diaspora. And of course, Professor Christina Maranci played her own very important role in that. So it was when Ani was declared on the World Heritage List, it was the culmination of this effort to bring together various kinds of constituencies in order to honor the ruins of Ani and to rehabilitate them in a way that measures up to the latest standards of historic preservation and architectural preservation. So July 2016 was a great moment. It seemed that with Ani, this kind of culture as engagement, culture as even perhaps at some point reconciliation was making headway. But of course, within hours of this historic meeting, there was the attempted coup in Turkey. And we all know that in the wake of the attempted coup, there was a change in the Turkish leadership towards greater authoritarianism. And in fact, one of the architects of the process that led to Ani being listed, Osman Kavala, the well-known public intellectual, cultural heritage activists and businessmen in Turkey, was imprisoned in 2017 on preposterous charges, and he remains in prison today. So these kinds of culture as engagement is something that has a lot of promise, but it can also be extremely fragile and vulnerable to all kinds of political and other developments. I just want to make a final point about the Mostar Bridge. So we all remember the Mostar Bridge in Eastern Europe, what a symbol it was when it was destroyed, and how symbolic it was that it was rebuilt. And it was thought that rebuilding the bridge was a way to visually signify the healing of divisions within the society, the healing of divisions within society torn by civil war. But as anthropologists and other heritage professionals on the ground have increasingly found, is that the rebuilt Mostar Bridge has almost become an empty symbol, because actual reconciliation on the ground has remained elusive. The bridge is reconstructed, but it does not reflect an engagement. And these engagements can only happen. International organizations can do a lot, but the actual engagements and repair and future developments are really in the hands of local communities and local organizations. And I'll only give one example of the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage in Cyprus, which is a bi-communal committee composed of Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, that was established originally as a very limited organization where they were going to deal with very technical aspects, sewage, thinking about roads, potholes, those kinds of things. And over time, it has become a fragile and yet very hopeful example of what can happen when the local communities, representatives of local communities, can find a way to engage with each other and work together towards doing very specific things. Big issues have not been solved in Cyprus, but some measure of success for caring about the urban environment and caring about monuments is being achieved, and I say this very cautiously, by groups like this. Of course, this group in Cyprus was established sometime after conflict was over. It's very difficult to create trust, especially when you've had a violent conflict, the kind that we've recently seen. But the future is in the hand of those on the ground. And long after UNESCO or other organizations leave, it is the communities that are going to have to figure out a way to build their future and to occupy this piece of land. And to honor the heritage of the previous centuries that is on this piece of land. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heghnar. Thank you very much. Yeah, the bridge at Mostar is sadly now separating two quite different communities rather than bridging them as they had hoped, but it is, I guess we still have to hope for that. Thank you. I didn't mention at the beginning that one reason for inviting Heghnar is because she actually teaches on arts and conflict and travels to speak about this. So we're very fortunate to have these examples. Thank you very much. I think, there may be some of you sitting out there thinking, let's just focus on Karabakh, on Artsakh right now, but I think it is important for context and for learning what to do, to see what other people in similar situations have done or trying to do, and also to get a perspective and to put our own troubles in context. I'd like to ask both Christina and Heghnar to come back somehow. I don't know how the three of us can do it, but do you have questions for each other? Anything you want to follow up on here before we go on to questions from the audience?
Can I ask, Can I ask Christina to say more about emergency art history and the promise of that?
Yeah, thanks, Heghnar, from a fellow art historian. Yeah, most of the time we think of art history as kind of a fun leisure time thing you do when you've done everything else. And then if there's any time left over, you sit in a library and look at pretty pictures. But I think what we're seeing now more than ever is that art history has the potential to inform and persuade. But art history, and I think this is something where we also want to make a distinction between art history art history as it's practiced all over the world. And I would say the thing about what we do, what you see particularly in the United States, is art history informed by social questions. So we like to ask, and I would say more than maybe anywhere else, is who made it? Why did they make it? As much as what is made. So the kind of wonderful documentation you get from the research on Armenian architecture, for example, is amazing. That the point, their goals are not to ask who and why, but the questions who and why actually are really useful in building a case for why these monuments are important to an Armenian tradition. And so that's where, I think emergency art history, as I've decided to call it, comes in, because what I think you can do is show, for example, with not, a huge amount of backbreaking research, how something like the breastfeeding virgin at Handapert is interesting. That can be part of a kind of case that you build for why we need to pay attention to these works and protect them. So maybe that kind of helps. But the point really, I think the bigger point is that so often we think of art history as it's the classic discipline that you don't need, it's always kind of made fun of for that. In fact, Obama made a joke about it now in the 90s, I guess. But what we see now is we need it, and we need it for many different reasons in order to defend what's rightly, the Armenian character of the monuments in Artsakh, the churches and monasteries in Artsakh. So finally we have a job to do, and it's a big one, but we can do it. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Heghnar.
Yeah. Well, I think, Christina, you also made other points about why it's so important. It's also for our souls, it's important for our beauty, it's important and also philosophically, art history is a very important thing to think about, how people perceive the world and the different ways around the world it's perceived. So don't be so worried about it.
Yeah, no, I'm probably more defensive than I should be. But then again, I'm a chair and I have to deal with deans, and they've got they've got their line items going. But I think the other thing I'd say too about art history as it's practiced in the United States is it's an intensely interdisciplinary endeavor. So we look at inscriptions, we look at history, we look at theology, we look at history, we think about the technical problems of building, we think about connections across traditions, we think about literature and poetry. So it's a wonderful way to not only to understand a monument, I think is an essential way to understand a monument, a medieval monument that isn't something that is classified in terms of architecture, fresco, sculpture, inscriptions. These are like, they're entire works of art. What's the German term? So, and that's how they were meant to be experienced. And so I think that that's where American art history, and maybe more broadly for my English friends, Anglophone art history is really important, because we can do that work. That's not just about the forms, but is about the entire picture of why something was created in the way it was.
I think it's also worth asking, coming now, the three of us actually have American educations, but you also get a lot of non-specialists taking your courses for their liberal arts requirements and so on. And Heghnar, I'm thinking that you probably have a lot of non-majors taking art and conflict, or taking your other courses that cross disciplinary lines. Is that the case?
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. So I also teach in a human rights studies program. So the framework there is to think about the intersection between art history, the study of monuments, cultural heritage as a professional practice, the practice of historic preservation in architecture, and how they relate to human rights paradigms. So there is a whole infrastructure of cultural rights, both internationally established and specific to different countries, that have things to say about the importance of culture and cultural life, the importance of being able to participate in cultural life without discrimination, the importance of freedom of expression, and so on. And from that perspective, for me, it's very important to emphasize that these incredible monuments in Artsakh are also part of communities. So they are, of course, as an art historian, I am impressed, deeply impressed and inspired by their artistry and the historic questions that they pose. But from a human rights perspective, it's also important to recall that they are living, they're part of a living faith. So unlike Tikranagerd, which is an archaeological site, Amaras or Dadivank, there are priests there. There are people there, people who go on pilgrimages there, people who get baptized there. So this is these monuments are part of the past, but they're also part of the present, as the religious sites of a living religious community that is global, right? If you look at people who have given gifts to important Artsakh monasteries like Kansasar or Dadivank, historically and in the present, they include Armenians from Iran, from the United States, from all parts of the world where Armenians live. So the relationship between the monuments as objects and the monuments as part of communities of faith, of practice, the role of the monuments in cultural life in general in Karabakh, and how important it is for everyone to enjoy their right to participate in cultural life of the community. So those are the kinds of issues that fall under my art history meets human rights area. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. And also, I'm just thinking as you were both speaking that if there are young people or people who want to go back for further degrees, this is something to think about, that's becoming part of the emergency art history teams. There's lots of really interesting and very different way that art history teaching has evolved over the years. It's fantastic. I think we should probably turn towards our the rest of the folks here. I was going to say our audience, but it's difficult when you can't see anybody. I know you're out there. And I think Dativik has a question, but I'd like to first introduce our friend Rafi Tanyelian, who's just back from Artsakh, where he was attending a church service, one of the last church services that was there. I don't know, Rafi, if you want to say a word. I can't see you. Datu, can you see him?
Yes, Rafi spotlighted, Rafi, and
Hi, can you see and hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. No, actually, as I went to Artsakh pretty much last minute, I thought it was important to carry out services in some of these chapels, as I think they were smaller than churches. A lot of the ones we went to, I mean, they were literally enough for 10, 15 people. They were tiny little places. And it was important to go. We went with Sirpazan from London, and we carried out, hopefully not the final services that Armenians will carry out in these places. And it was very, very sad, as you can imagine. But we went with journalists to sort of try and make as much noise as possible. And I think that was important. It was important to sort of say goodbye to these places, or, without sounding too pretentious, au revoir, I suppose, hoping to see them again.
Thank you, Rafi. That was
Thanks.
Great that you could go. Do you have a question for either of these while you're online?
Well, I'm online.
You could ask.
No, I mean, I think maybe actually it'll be nice to elaborate a little bit more on the emergency art history, though, because obviously it's something that you know, I think it's a question to both of you, because Heghnar was saying about the ability to sort of capture these things just with sort of basic phone cameras and things like that nowadays, and it's just, I think it's important for us to keep records of these places and build databases and that kind of thing of as much information of these places as possible. I mean, we've talked about the cultural cleansing program that Azerbaijan is planning to implement, and one of the things I was talking to Surpazan and Verhapad about last week was, you know, that this idea of the Caucasian Albanian Christianity that Azerbaijan are sort of proposing to implement as their whitewashing of these monuments as their own. And interestingly, the Verhapad said that when there was this Albanian Christianity for the brief period that it did exist, it actually did fall under the auspices of the Armenian Echmiadzin Verhapad. So even if they do claim it as theirs, it's something that we say, well, yes, it did exist in your lands, but it kind of came under our control. So whatever you want to talk about is it's difficult to appropriate it as for Azerbaijanis, I suppose. Oh, sorry, I'll let other people speak.
Thank you, Rafi. Thank you. Heghnar or Christina, do you want to respond to that?
Just thank you, Rafi, for your work in Artsakh. It's really heroic, and thank you for doing it. Look forward to seeing the results.
I would just say, from the perspective of historic preservation, the Albanian theory, even if it were correct that these churches were at some point Albanian, they are Armenian churches now. They have priests there now, and the inscriptions are there now. They are part of the biography of these sites. So the idea, the incredibly problematic aspect of the Albanian theory is not only that the way it is presented, it is historically counterfactual, but it also ignores basic ideas about historic preservation, which is to respect all layers of a structure. The way that this Albanian theory is presented is that they were at one point Albanian, that's it. Everything Armenian about them is a lie. That's not how it works in historic preservation. All aspects of a monument are valuable and contribute to its complete biography. There should be room for understanding all of its aspects. And thank you, Rafi, for the incredible work that you and your colleagues have done. I know it's not easy.
Thank you. Dr. Vig, I think you have a question. Somebody has sent you a question, did you say, while we were?
Yes, I have a few questions which started coming in privately, and let me read it out. It's from Tatevik Mnatsakani, and probably continuation of Rafi's previous comment. This is to both of our speakers. What tools do art history and art and conflict studies, in case of Heghnar, give us to counter historical falsifications such as Azeri attempts at organizing Armenian monuments? Any parallels from elsewhere?
So what tools? I'll deal with the art history part, I guess, although I'm sure Heghnar could do that too. What tools so I think it's really what a scholar does. We look at primary texts in original languages, and forgive me, I mean, if this isn't answering the question, but we do that work. We look at the physical evidence. We do our historical contextual work, and we do it without bias as well as we can, knowing that nobody's perfectly neutral. And we weigh the evidence and we make the argument. And I don't know any other way to do art history than to do that. And but that is, when done in a solid way, can I think, maybe I'm naive, but I think at least it provides some kind of foundation for the truth, so that one can combat, the silly claims. But then again, I think, social media trolls will say what they want to say, and I probably could produce as many articles as I wanted, and it wouldn't matter. I don't know, but I think at the same time, there's a way perhaps of using the evidence that you gather and the arguments that you gather from a more sustained work in art history to communicate in plain language to the public your findings, and whether that's about, let's say, the Armenian inscription at Gandzasar, or whether it's about the relationship of the breastfeeding virgin at Handabert with Toros Toronetsi. You can, I think, do good work in informing the public. And the advantage of art history in this sense is that it's visual, and that people are immediately sort of, get it in a way that's harder to do, let's say, with a primary text. So I think that's the work that needs to be done, and should be done. That kind of careful art historical work that I think will demonstrate what the evidence is. So maybe that part isn't the emergency part, but the emergency part would be kind of culling from that in kind of in clear language, communicating your findings. Okay, sorry.
I obviously completely endorse what Christina said. I think what all the historical disciplines, including art history, offer is that our methodology is about understanding proof, understanding evidence. What is our evidence? And we have very sophisticated methodologies for weighing that evidence and understand it, interpret it, and in a very transparent and open way. So that said, as we have learned from the history of Armenian genocide denial, a lot of the arguments of the denialists, are not solid arguments, and they have been debunked many, many times. But this does not prevent denial from taking out the same arguments over and over again. What we're dealing with there is power imbalance, power structures, and powerful institutions that throw their, whether it's a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of a particular country or other, that throw their weight around a particular way of seeing the past that is an exclusive way and that vilifies a certain group or glorifies another group. So in some ways, no matter how high quality the art history that has been done is, that's not going to stop those who want to proclaim the Albanian thesis from pursuing that. So I think the struggle that we have as individuals who value all of the cultural heritage of Artsakh, Armenian, Islamic, civic, religious, etc., and we all want to be universal and fair and value all the entire cultural landscape of this really interesting region. I think for those of us who adhere to this value, the challenge is to counter those who want to see this landscape in a very exclusive way on multiple dimensions. It's not only art history that has a role to play, it is also history, but it is also the state the things that only a state can do. Only a state can be a member of UNESCO. That's why Artsakh is not a member of UNESCO, because it's not a member of the United Nations, because it is not a recognized state. It's one of the reasons why the human rights and cultural rights of Karabakhis have not been, they have not been able to exercise those rights, because they have been in this gray zone, not quite a state, not quite a not state, not exactly part of Azerbaijan, not exactly part of their own. So it's really multidimensional, and that's why it requires many different kinds of competencies. And that's that part of what Christina and I and our many colleagues are trying to do, is to build a network of activists and that have various perspectives.
I just wanted to jump in and in addition, I wanted to say that in addition to writing and publishing, and I'll just speak from my own experience, I'm asked to consult on projects, through NGOs and the State Department. And so it's not like I just sit in my little office and write about, the breastfeeding virgin at Handaberd. But actually, there is a way in which I have knowledge. My specialized knowledge is useful to to those people who make the policies, actually, and who do the projects and who are authorized to do the projects. So I should have said that at the beginning. So there is I do have that use as well. And art historians, we need to be consulted on projects of restoration, particularly when it's fraught. So that's just something else to throw in there. It's not like we're sort of sitting passively by, but we are kind of behind the scenes sometimes, in front of the scenes sometimes, doing work, like at ANI, for example. Just another thought.
Thank you both. Thank you. We have a lot of questions, so I'd like to go on. Maybe we'll I'll bunch them together if I can, and also if you could maybe have shorter answers, that'd be great. It's impossible because it's such a great subject, an important subject. We have one from Gabriela Bomba, who says, thank you for the webinar, for the great webinar. And do you know if there's a sort of inventory of sites and monuments in Artsakh and 7 districts in English and with clear locations? She wants to translate them to Italian to help with a motion to the Italian Parliament. Now, related to that would be Rachel Goshgarian. She says, my question is something many of us have been discussing and wondering about these days. Why do we need emergency art history these days? Why hasn't the history or art history of Artsakh been studied thoroughly? Is it because it's a periphery of a periphery in the aftermath of a war? It would seem like there were some major research projects undertaken in Artsakh, but seemingly not enough was done. She's, of course, referring to the last war. Could you both try to explain how you're thinking about this these days? Okay, that's 2 together, so. One of you.
Go ahead. Yeah, I think Rob. Go ahead, Heghnar. Did you want to go ahead?
Oh, I will take the second question first, Rachel's question. I think it's a very good question. Why is it that more research has not been done on Karabakh? I would submit that part of it, again, is that it has been an unrecognized area. If you think of how research is done, how institutionally, the infrastructure of research, how you get funding, you can get a Fulbright fellowship to Armenia. It's a state, it's recognized, but you cannot get a Fulbright fellowship to go to Artsakh. So the fact that this has been this gray area legally, institutionally for so long has really harmed many things, the human rights of the Karabakhis in the first place, but also harmed the ability to conduct research. The fact that if you want to do, say you want to do a project on an Islamic monument in Karabakh, you can't easily go to Azerbaijan and state archives and do research project there on an Armenian topic. So there's a whole series of obstacles and difficulties to overcome that make it, in a very real way, very, very difficult.
Could I just add before you come in, Christina, that we have a Armenian Institute used to have host a project that Tanya King, Dr. Tanya King, paleoanthropologist, is doing with Artsakh caves, and she had exactly that problem, Heghnar, that funding was virtually impossible to get, even though she was doing such an important work with early humans. Mm-hmm. So just to agree with that.
Yeah, I think I would only add that, you know, scholarship is cumulative. And so, you know, you look at the late 19th and early 20th century works that were produced by European scholars who came to work in Armenia, and then kind of things rolled on from there, and that never happened. You know, like Joseph Strykovsky didn't go to Artsakh, and you know, so that also that has its repercussions down the line. And just because someone asked about a list, and I think Rafi put the research on Armenian architecture and regarding the question about a list, an inventory in English. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that. But.
Thank you, Rafi. So that's further down in the chat line, people. You can check it out. Dato, you said you had a question, or somebody has sent you a private question, I think.
Yes, there was a question from, let me scroll up, from Michel Corcotian, who says this might be a naive question, but is there a way that others can be embarrassed in front of the international community not to destroy our ancient artifacts?
I think that's the hope. I mean, the point of all of this pressure, I mean, I'm sure all of you have seen in the last few days, there have been statements from a number of prominent cultural organizations. UNESCO has made a statement, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, ICOMOS, and Europa Nostra, a number of other international organizations have called upon all the parties, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Russian peacekeepers, etc., all the parties on the ground to respect the generally agreed conventions on the safeguarding of monuments in wartime and in peacetime. So that it's that process. As a friend of mine used to say, who is a human rights professional, the shaming is a really efficient tool if the person you're trying to shame is susceptible to that. But in her case, her activism is directed towards Saudi Arabia, and she has found that if you're not ashamed, if you're impervious to that, that can be a blunt tool. But it just like scholarship is cumulative, so are these kinds of statements. Human rights work is also cumulative. You build on these kinds of statements by prominent organizations. You add to that the work of people on the ground, activists on the ground. And it's a cumulative and very long and very slow process. And at every point, a failure is a possibility. It's very, very fragile and requires a lot of effort at many different scales. But we have no choice but to do it, right?
Right. Thank you, Heghnar. We have several questions that are similar, not connected, let's call it. Did we answer that one? Are we okay? Yeah, okay. Yes, from Heinrich Gother. Sorry if I mispronounced. If the status of World Heritage for any Artsakh monument can protect them in the emergency situation of cultural cleansing, how fast UNESCO could decide to declare this status? Days, weeks, months, hopefully not longer. Alice Hovanesian asks, in your experience, how effective are UNESCO and other World Heritage bodies in preserving monuments in this kind of emergency situation? And one more about UNESCO. Hello, I used to work for, from Heather Conyers. I used to work for UNESCO Armenia. In my experience, it's very slow for processing. It takes years. Also, there is the clear issue within UNESCO of disproportionate representation in many of their projects. Would either of you like to comment on those that are connected by the UNESCO? They're slightly different in each case.
Certainly, UNESCO is an organization that is hobbled by its own structure. It can only operate through its member states. And states are reluctant to criticize each other in the UN context. It is also hobbled by some of its past, as alluded to the question said about disproportionality. There's a wonderful new book by Lynn Meskel called The Future in Ruins that is an ethnography of UNESCO and the World Heritage idea, and a very interesting critique. So I really recommend that. It takes not years, centuries for UNESCO to move. So that's a challenge. And also, because UNESCO only moves through member states, it's going to be interesting. I don't know who UNESCO would consider the member state when we're talking about Dadivank, or is it Azerbaijan? So you have to work through Azerbaijan, and the same Ministry of Culture that is propagating this Albanian narrative in order to safeguard Armenian religious monuments from the Albanian narrative. So you can see that this is difficult. So I think it's going to demand that UNESCO take a particular approach. UNESCO has done exceptional things in the past, as in the former Yugoslavia, when there's a conflict situation. But there are also other organizations. Blue Shield International, for example, specializes in intervening or trying to do good in conflict and post-conflict situations. But ultimately, again, this is coming from the field of critical cultural heritage. It is really the people on the ground who are going to shape the future. International organizations can parachute in and they can lend expertise, or they can try to put pressure on governments, or they can maybe raise funds. There's a lot of good things they can do, but ultimately it's the people on the ground who are going to find a way or not find a way to protect their monuments, to work together, to figure out things like infrastructure, roads, etc. And that's the real and very difficult challenge, because we are right teetering on the end of a really brutal and brutalizing war. And so it's going to be very, very difficult. And Arabatsis and everyone involved is really going to need all of the support of those of us outside who care about this landscape and these communities and these monuments. So we have a very long road ahead. There are not going to be any easy solutions.
Thank you, Heghnar. Christina, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to say that, I mean, yeah, UNESCO is slow, and there are organizations that are faster and can help, at least with the recording of information. I mean, and also look at what UNESCO's at Ani, right? They, with the inscription of Ani, but how has that, I guess I would ask, how has that changed things at Ani in ways that World Monuments Fund hadn't already done? And World Monuments Fund is another organization that was working at Ani before that. So, and then, of course, we know that UNESCO completely ignored the Julfa Cemetery destruction. So there's that. That's all I have to add.
Thank you. I know that Christina at least has to leave. I had promised her a 9 o'clock halt, but she's agreed to have one more question. And I know Nuritza has asked if she could. I didn't realize she'd sent one privately. So, but I don't see the question. Nuritza, can you quickly unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes. First of all, thank you both very much indeed. It was an extraordinary evening. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about art washing and how actually on the ground now, not at an academic level, but how to counter that. Is there a role for the individual? I've come up across a kind of resistance to writing about these topics in a German newspaper, and obviously Turkey has done huge amount in order to change the current opinion, and also Azerbaijan has. So what do we do as individuals or as a community to help the work that you're doing and to get our message across? And I'm thinking particularly of art washing. You know,
Yes.
how to counter that, how to counter all the lies.
Thank you, Nuritza. It's a great question. I find it so hard even to read when I was doing research to put this PowerPoint together, I found it hard even to go to those sites that talk about the Albanianness of the monuments. So already it's hard even to look at it, let alone respond to it. But I think I notice that what people seem to be doing more and more is just raising their voices and trying to counter the art washing, at least in the form of social media posts with counter posts about how these are Armenian monuments. I mean, I think sorry, I don't know, I have a phone call. That's one way to do it. And but I've never been in this position before where I've had to argue something as Armenian. Well, I guess kind of maybe at Ani too. Anyway.
Your article in the Wall Street Journal was great, for instance.
Yeah, thanks. The only way I can think of dealing with it is really just constantly sort of repeating oneself. But the Albanian argument is very strange, and it does seem to have legs. So, but I don't know, maybe Heghnar has some more ideas about how to counter it. But in my view, the more in terms of, sort of volume we can turn up about the monuments, particularly for people who have no idea. I mean, these are both words that begin with A for a lot of people, right? I mean, right? So that's about as far as it goes for some people. So I think explaining, and this is where art history comes in, because you can show in depth, it's not just that it's Armenian, but this is how, this is why, is important to give the argument some texture. And even better, I would say, Nuritza, is to have a variety of opinions about the monument's Armenianness. So it's not just one voice, one kind of monolithic, it's Armenian, it's Armenian, it's Armenian, but to say, it is, and it is, for example, Ganzasar is the work of Hasan Daula, and this is what, this is what he was this political person, and this is what he did, and he called himself the king of Artsakh, so that you have a kind of, again, a depth to the Armenianness, if you like. I think that's awfully persuasive in a way that maybe just saying something is Armenian isn't. I mean, anybody can do that. So just some thoughts.
That's great. Heghnar, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. So from a human rights, go ahead. I'm sorry, you were going to say
I just wanted to interrupt you just for 1 sec. Christina, you told me you need to leave, so we could say goodbye to you while Heghnar answers, if you really do need to go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have student office hours an hour, and they're going to kill me because their paper's due. So I have to go and deal
You'll
with
understand that, I think.
Yeah, but thank you so much for everything, and
thank you, Christina.
We're
really honored you came. Thank you.
Susan. Thanks to the Armenian Institute.
We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Right. So from a human rights perspective, the response to bad speech is good speech, right? And I'm on my screen, I see Mark Mamigonian from Nasser, who of course is one of the many important voices that has dedicated his life to countering untruth and countering denial. And it's an ongoing process because it doesn't, the logic of denial is such that it even if what you're saying is perfectly well reasoned, perfectly well expressed, perfectly reasonable, it doesn't matter because it goes on its own logic and declares everything else fake news. Denial doesn't have to be a high quality argument. It can be a very silly argument, but it's propelled by power, not by logic. Still, the response can only be good speech, more of it, stand firm, understand what we're saying, what the argument is, what are the reasonable arguments, and stick to them. But also from a human rights perspective, what I want to emphasize is the importance of what in human rights speak they call cultural rights defenders, local cultural defenders. And I'm thinking of Simon Marakian's incredible research on the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage in Nakhichevan, and the various actors that he identified in priests, researchers, normal people from Soviet times until the early 2000s, who understood what's going on, understood the importance of recording the Khachkars in Julfa and elsewhere before they disappear. Even if they didn't have the means or didn't know how to do it, they learned how to do it. They're doing it. And the various other actors who tried to record and bear witness to what was going on. And it is thanks to their work that today we can point, their work has now become evidence, the evidence that we can use to say, look, Azerbaijan as a state has this past behavior that is the evidence that we have to predict any indication of future behavior. The kinds of local activists who have been recording the assaults on culture that took place since the war began in September 27. So it's these people on the ground who, maybe they're not art historians, they're not cultural heritage professionals, I don't know what they are, hairdressers, priests, but when we saw this in so many places during the destruction of heritage that was part of the Arab Spring, these are the people who spring into action in order to defend cultural heritage. And I think their role has to really be recognized. We spend a lot of time thinking about international organizations that have a big presence, they have money, their voice is powerful, but ultimately these are the individuals who are going to be key in anything that goes forward. And so I also want to honor them and shed light on their work and how important their work is. And so one of the things that I would like us to think about collectively is how we can support them and learn from them.
Very well said, I think, and it's extremely important and very actually very difficult because you don't want to get people in trouble either.
Yeah.
So it's got to be done sensitively. Heghnar, thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
And for your wonderful presentation and for not coming back to me and saying what a ridiculous idea it was. But I know that, looking at the work that you do and the work that I know about you, I knew that you'd be perfect. So
thank you so much.
Fantastic. Could I ask everybody to look through the group chat because I haven't read everything out. There's some people made comments like Mark Mamigonian and Alan Whitehorn and Heather. Also, Rafi has put important information in the chat line. Rafi Tanyelian, thank you, Rafi. And of course, Datavik has put our feedback form in. We need that for our funding, please. It only takes 2 seconds. And I'm afraid we're done, actually. I have to let you go. You probably have students lining up on Zoom or something. Thank you, Heghnar. We're really
Thank
grateful.
you so much. Thank you all.
And
thank you,
thank you
Susan.
to everybody for coming tonight.